risk of climate change, catastrophic climate change. And I think increasingly investors are aware of that, and even company CEOs are aware of that. In conversations I've had with company CEOs, none of them dispute the challenge that climate risk presents to their business.
Thank you. You are also the member of the ICCR, so you might be familiar with, actually, about the recent change of the corporate America. In Japan, we heard a lot of stories about Exxon, what happened in ExxonMobil, and now the Chevron is surrounded by ESG activists. What's the secret behind this, the big change behind this shift in corporate America? Could you tell me your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, it's a little, I think there are a number of factors, Cope. One, I believe undoubtedly is the urgency of the climate crisis. The companies like Exxon and other denied that for a long time and denied their operations role in that and the externalization of the costs of that. I think that we can no longer avoid that the threat, the risk of climate change, catastrophic climate change. And I think increasingly investors are aware of that, and even company CEOs are aware of that. In conversations I've had with company CEOs, none of them dispute the challenge that climate risk presents to their business. That was not the case 10 years ago. That I don't think there was that general understanding. From an investor standpoint, which translates into the 4 votes, I think for a long time, investors weren't, particularly large institutional investors, were seeing this as a values question. They didn't realize the business implications of it from climate change, which essentially is a systemic risk. You can't dispute that. It's a systemic risk to every business in the world. And so, some institutional investors would say, well, we don't take positions on climate change. To some extent, that's beyond the point. You have to look at what the risks that climate change presents to businesses and to long-term shareholder value. And I think there's been a transition in thinking from institutional investors on that, that they're increasingly seeing the systemic risk will impact long-term shareholder value if companies aren't working to mitigate that. My concern, frankly, is, I'll use my personal podium here. My concern is that we don't overly focus on resilience to the detriment of climate mitigation. Because again, resiliency is important, but it's a short-term solution. It's not addressing the root causes of climate change. And so, unfortunately, one of the challenges for businesses in the world today is they need to do both. They need to build resilience and work to mitigate climate change, which is forcing them to be resilient. You can't just deal with a short-term protection. You need to strike at the root causes of why you need resiliency, and that's because of the impacts of climate change. So, my hope is that investors will support both those actions and not focus just on resiliency. Because from a values perspective, when groups focus on resiliency, they tend to focus on their own self-interest, and inevitably the lower income disadvantaged groups suffer. because they have less resources to be resilient. So that's where our values-based perspective comes into play here.
So about climate change, I heard a lot of stories that the Japanese companies tend to end up to be a laggard in terms of climate change, the shift towards the climate change. You made a great case, and if you could tell messages to Japanese, ESG or people who are in charge of IR, what could you tell them about this?
Well, I think I've hit those points. It's the urgency of the climate crisis, which, as I noted, will affect all nations, and certainly Japan as well as the U.S. The other thing that I've seen, Ko, in doing this, my career has been as a business person, but more recently, the last 10 years or so, in socially responsible investing and shareholder engagement. And I've worked for some large corporations in the past. And investors and shareholders can bring a unique external perspective to company management. We often see ourselves, because we're long-term investors, we see ourselves as a canary in a coal mine. So we're raising issues before they're on the company's radar screen as concerns. And that's because, increasingly in the US, and I'm less familiar with the Japanese markets, but there's even the span of my career, corporations have moved to a much shorter planning and time frame. Everything is about short-term profit these days, which doesn't work towards long-term value creation, in my opinion, as a business person. And so, as a long-term stakeholder, we can say, we don't want you to focus on maximizing coal revenue today. We want you positioning this business for the future. And so let's ensure that your spend is going towards that and is in alignment with your overall company principles and the way you're positioning yourself publicly. And that was exactly the case with Norfolk Southern. And I've had more than one top management corporate executive say, look, we don't often hear these concerns from other shareholders. So they say that in one breath, and then in the second breath, they say, we appreciate that you're coming from a values perspective and that you have a long-term approach here. Because they don't often get that from other shareholders who are very focused on the short term, less focused on the long term, and where the company's going over the long term and its long-term sustainability. And as long-term investors, that's very important for us.
I'm so grateful that you have shared about the case of NSC, Nobuo Sazen. I'm wondering what's the way of representing the value as a Quaker's way, because there are very few people in Japan who understand what the value of Quaker. Could you share?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, we work to represent Quaker values in our investment process, and I think the key values, typically when Quakers talk about value, we talk about our testimonies, and those are questions we ask ourselves to determine whether we're living up to our faith. And those kind of testimonies and the questions around them are on simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship. So I mentioned integrity earlier in terms of, is a company doing privately what it's saying it's doing publicly? And that's where lobbying becomes a focus for us, because companies often lobby directly against something they're publicly saying they're for, which is why companies have fought these lobbying proposals vigorously through their filings. So in stewardship, I noticed is noted is one of the other values, and that's care for creation, climate change, living, preserving the earth and our ability to have everyone live here on the planet. The kind of one of the overarching beliefs of Quakers there's that of the divine in everyone, which leads us to the peace testimony. So if there's the divine or God or whatever words one chooses to use, if each of us have that inherent value and worth, then that leads us to the peace testimony of not wanting to harm others. And so part of our work is to remove the occasion for wars. So, wars come up when there's injustice, when there's inequality. And so that leads to our values around those issues. From a screening perspective, we focus on those, we screen out those companies which we feel produce goods or services that are not beneficial to society. So we screen out and always have alcohol, weapons, weapons components, tobacco, any firearms, of course. And then Quakers also don't believe in gambling. And so we've excluded gambling operations, and we've always excluded for-profit prisons as well, which I think is a uniquely American invention, and not a positive one. We don't think it's a good way to deal with the penal system. So those are the values that we work to reflect in our investment. So we don't hold any companies that produce weapons, and we strive for zero tolerance there. So even if it's just 5% of a company's revenue, we will exclude that. Because our faith-based investors don't want to be supporting that through their investments in their assets.